I'm Dan Rundy. I hold the Schreier Chair here at CSIS. Welcome to our Chevron Forum on Development. I want to thank my friends at Chevron for being our friends and supporters of all this. Thank you very much. We're rolling out our task force report. I don't think I have to get into too much detail about what this is about. I think you all have voted with your feet. Thank you for being here. I want to specifically thank Senators Young and Shaheen. I also really need to thank their key staffers, Will and Naz from Senator Shaheen's shop. And then I need to also specifically thank Brad Bowman, who really was a very important part of this process. So Brad, thank you very, very much. It's pretty unheard of what we've done. We pulled all this together in 8 weeks. No one does this in 8 weeks in Washington. These things take 6 months or 12 months. We pulled together 30 former ambassadors, USAID administrators, former Bush administration folks, and former Obama political appointees. We asked them to help us answer the question, well, how could we increase our effectiveness, efficiency, and accountability in our foreign assistance? We met 3 times in the month of June. We reviewed a mountain of literature. We interviewed a couple of dozen people. We went through 4 major draft revisions of this. My colleagues, Connor Savoy and Ariel Yaiboke, deserve much of the credit for having to ride herd on all of that and adjudicate 60 sets of comments from some very opinionated and smart people. So thank you, Connor and Ariel. I also want to thank Jenna Santoro for all of your work. Thank you, Jenna. So we had 3 big recommendations: maintain USAID as an independent agency overseeing federal foreign assistance efforts, develop a clearly articulated development strategy, and assign the USAID administrator as coordinator of foreign assistance. Number 2 was address duplication of effort and generate budget savings while maintaining functional coherence where appropriate. And then the 3rd was modernize the personnel system, make the procurement system more efficient, and streamline reporting. This 3rd one, this is not the stuff that gets your heart pumping. I mean, it's very stultifying stuff, but it's very, very critical and very, very important. So you actually want to do this right. We got to fix the plumbing is what we have to do. So you're going to hear a lot more about the details of this with the panel, but I'm very pleased to have Senator Young here to kick this off. Senator Young is the Republican senator from Indiana, one of the 2 senators from Indiana, of course, but he has been a force for good in the U.S. Senate and is somebody who has been very thoughtful about soft power. He had served as a staffer at one point for Senator Lugar, if I recall correctly. So I think in many ways I hear echoes of Senator Lugar and much of what Senator Young has been doing. So I'm very grateful you're here and very grateful for all of your assistance and your leadership. So Senator Young, please come on up. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Dan, for that generous introduction. And it's really a pleasure to be here today for this rollout of the Bipartisan Task Force report on the reform and reorganization of U.S. development assistance. Dan, I of course want to thank you for your heroic and extraordinary efforts in a very compressed time period here. As you said, it's unusual for such important work to occur in such a short period of time here in Washington, D.C. And I think we've produced a substantive report that is more than worthy of serious consideration. And that certainly wouldn't be possible, Dan, without your leadership. I, too, want to thank your 2 deputies. Errol Yaiboke, I always have to look down. I'm sorry, Errol. And then Connor Savoy, that one's a little easier for me. The 2 of them played indispensable roles in actually collating, assimilating, synthesizing various feedback and input we received from different stakeholders. And I want to thank Brad Bowman, as well as Jean Shaheen's staffers. But Brad really provided what I like to call a lot of the kinetic energy behind this effort to move it forward and in short order. I, of course, want to thank Jean Shaheen. She is a serious legislator with whom I've already worked on multiple issues. Regrettably, she's had some flight trouble, so she won't be able to join us here today, and I know she feels badly about that, but she'll continue to work with us on this bipartisan initiative as we sit down with the administration and other interested stakeholders. And finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't thank the task force members themselves. They contributed their time, their expertise, their institutional knowledge, an impressive bipartisan group. and our nation's leading development experts help put this report together. So the report we're launching today, which most of you have seen, is entitled Reforming and Reorganizing U.S. Foreign Assistance, Increased Efficiency and Effectiveness. Now, in these fairly brief, introductory remarks, forgive me, I'm a U.S. Senator now, I'd like to highlight three central assertions of the report we're unveiling today. First, this report unambiguously, unabashedly, and I hope persuasively, argues that U.S. development assistance is in our national security interest. Second, the report argues that reform of our nation's development assistance is overdue, long overdue, and necessary. And third, in addition to several specific action steps that we put forward, this report lays out a few key principles that should guide this reform effort. So let me briefly touch on these 3 points. As I said, this report argues that development is a vital instrument of national policy to promote American security and also prosperity. Truly strategic thinking is characterized by an ends, ways, means sort of analysis. In other words, you start with what you're trying to accomplish, you examine the tools available, and then you develop a plan to utilize those tools as effectively as possible to protect and promote our most important interests and objectives in light of leading threats and challenges. Now, when I survey all the tools at our disposal, like others before me, I see three primary legs. We've got our diplomatic leg, we have our military leg, and of course we have our development leg. As someone who served in the U.S. Marine Corps, I recognize that sometimes there's a tendency to focus on the defense element, neglecting, underappreciating, and underfunding sometimes the development leg of our national security stool. However, as the report we are introducing today demonstrates, that would be short-sighted, it would be unwise, and it could even be dangerous. If we want to send our brave troops to war less often, if we want to bring them home sooner, then we shouldn't starve our development efforts of the resources they need. Now, given the diverse and growing array of threats and challenges we confront across the globe, we need to ensure that all available tools are optimized and employed as effectively as possible. And this includes development. I recognize our nation's development enterprise is in dire need of reform and improvement. I'll discuss that in a moment. I also recognize that development investments are sometimes long-term investments. They take years or even decades to come to fruition. But consider this analogy. Prudent moms and dads invest what they can towards their children's college and also towards their own retirements, even though those investments won't bear fruit for years or even decades. Prudent nations do effectively the same thing when it comes to our national security. While it might take a long time to see the benefits, well-implemented and monitored development can effectively promote our national security, create economic opportunities for Americans, and respond to humanitarian crises that can undermine both security and prosperity. Now, you don't have to take my word for it. I know we have many scholars of international development and students of history here in the audience today and watching online. Historically, our investments have paid real dividends in development. Look at the investments we made 70 years ago with the Marshall Plan after World War II. Those investments helped our allies rise out of the rubble of the world's most devastating war. The Marshall Plan helped transform vulnerable partners into valuable military allies and important trading partners, improving the security, prosperity of Americans at home. Those Marshall Plan investments created able partners who could carry more of the national security burden, taking some of that burden off of American shoulders. Now, admittedly, I'm sometimes as frustrated as anyone about our European allies. But remember, when our country was attacked on 9/11, our European allies, along with other allies, were there for us. Our NATO allies in Europe stepped forward, and they declared that an attack on the United States was an attack on them. Those weren't just fine words. They backed up their words with action. Our European allies, who decades before we had helped with the Marshall Plan, deployed thousands of their citizens to Afghanistan. They could have said the U.S. was attacked, not us, let the Americans handle it alone, but they did not. Not only did our European allies step forward and fight at our side in Afghanistan, many of them paid the ultimate price. In fact, more than 1,000 of our NATO allies laid down their lives in Afghanistan. Thank goodness that great American leaders after World War II understood that some investments are necessary even if they take time to bear fruit. In other words, the Marshall Plan was a good investment. Today, 11 of our top 15 trade partners are former recipients of U.S. foreign assistance. These were good investments. Consider that roughly 95% of the world's consumers live outside of the United States. Smart, targeted efforts to create conditions in which economies can develop overseas can create American jobs here at home. That's a good investment. Consider that our foreign assistance makes up no more than 1% of our federal budget. Now that is a good investment. In short, development is one of the three essential legs of our national security stool, and now more than ever, we need to ensure our nation's development enterprise is as effective and efficient as possible. So that brings me to a second central assertion of this report. Reform and reorganization of our nation's development assistance is overdue and necessary. We have a responsibility to the taxpayers of this country to periodically scrutinize government departments and agencies to ensure they're operating as efficiently as possible and serving as responsible stewards of the funds American people provide. But it's more than that. There hasn't been a major relook of our development assistance since the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961. Can you imagine a non-governmental organization or a private company? What would it look like after 55 years without a major review or reorganization? Well, I think we can say with confidence, if it's still around, it would be highly inefficient and outdated. That would be the best case scenario. It's more likely that that company or organization would be failing. Now, that's not to say there have been no changes in the decades since 1961. There have been a number of incremental changes, but those changes have resulted, I think it's fair to say, in a highly fragmented system. In fact, as our report highlights, there are over 20 federal agencies engaged in assistance overseas. That's resulted in a disjointed and inefficient system ripe for improvement. So for these reasons, reform and reorganization is overdue and necessary. And the Trump administration is right. They are right to call for improved efficiency, improved effectiveness, and more accountability in our nation's foreign assistance programs. The question is how best to achieve that improved efficiency, effectiveness, and accountability. As the administration and Congress consider the reform and reorganization of our development enterprise, I'd like to underscore two principles that should guide our efforts. First, we should start with a clear-eyed understanding of how the developing world has changed. As we undertake reform and reorganization, we need to design our institutions and programs to reflect the actual realities of the developing world today and tomorrow, not the way it was decades ago. So let me highlight just one example. On May 3rd, I chaired a Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee hearing on global philanthropy and remittances in international development. As that hearing revealed, and as our report highlights, in the 1960s, foreign assistance represented 70% of all financial flows to developing countries. Today, that number is just 13%. In the United States, foreign assistance represents only 9%. So what makes up the remainder? Well, it's private capital flows, it's foreign direct investment, it's remittances, it's philanthropy. Given that reality, if we're going to maximize the benefits of tax dollars we devote to development assistance, we need to harness the ingenuity, the creativity, the innovation, and the best practices of the private sector. Now, there's no doubt that foreign assistance will continue to play a vital role. But this new reality means we should seek to optimize the ability of our official assistance to serve as a catalyst and a connector to private philanthropy, to foreign direct investment, and to remittances, when these forces of good align with our interests and principles. Second, we need to proceed with reform deliberately and strategically. Now, that means not proceeding with hasty and arbitrary cuts to development assistance when we haven't conducted the kind of strategic analysis I discussed earlier. That's why I have introduced, along with Senator Shaheen, the National Diplomacy and Development Strategy Act of 2017. Such a strategy would accomplish a number of things. Number one, it would support the national security strategy. Number two, it would integrate and coordinate with the national defense strategy. Number three, it would identify and prioritize interests, threats, and opportunities. Four, it would break down stovepipes between departments and agencies. And five, it would guide reform efforts in the allocation of finite resources. To strengthen the development leg of our national security stool and inform this necessary and overdue reform, we convened this task force composed of a bipartisan coalition of former Republican and Democratic officials, as well as retired Foreign Service officers and civil servants. These distinguished experts have worked in the U.S. Congress, USAID, Treasury, the MCC, OPIC, the National Security Council, DOD, and the Department of State. Based on this depth and breadth of experience, the task force report launched today represents a collective long view of what has worked, what hasn't worked, and how we can succeed. This report presents a strong bipartisan agenda for assistance reform, reflecting the realities and challenges in developing countries. It argues for greater cohesion among agencies and presents thoughtful and actionable recommendations that, if implemented, I know would lead to improved efficiency, effectiveness, and accountability. And so for these reasons, as I close, I'm glad that so many of you are here today and watching online. I'm proud to have had the opportunity to co-chair this task force that has produced such a strong report. I hope our colleagues in Congress and the administration can rally behind this vision for our nation's development enterprise. Thank you again to CSIS for your leadership role on development and for allowing me to partner with you in this important endeavor. And I, of course, will look forward to our continued work together. Godspeed.
Great. Okay, I'm going to ask the panelists to come up, and Senator, if you might, I hope you'll stay for a little bit.
Yeah.
Great, thank you very much. Good. I'm going to ask my friend Connor Savoy, who's now at the Global Innovation Fund. He left us for greener pastures. Not that I'm upset about this or anything, because he's so great. He's now going to be moderating this really interesting panel of some really thoughtful people, some of the participants. Connor has been kind enough to remain affiliated with CSIS as a senior associate here at the center, but has this new life at the Global Innovation Fund. So Connor, without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over to you. Okay, sir.
Thanks, Dan, and it's a pleasure to be back. As Dan mentioned, I was formerly the Deputy Director of his program here at CSIS, and I'm still a Senior Associate, but now I've moved on to the Global Innovation Fund. So it's always nice to come back home, as it were, so it's nice to be here. I want to add my thanks to Senators Young and Shaheen for co-chairing this task force. It was a big time commitment, and I know that senators are very busy sometimes, but it's great to have that kind of leadership for something like this, so thank you to both of them. And thank you to Dan for putting this together and pushing it along, because it needed that. I'm honored to moderate this afternoon's panel of task force members. I have to say I am definitely feeling a little overwhelmed with the amount of experience that's on this task force versus what I have. But today I'm joined by Susan Reichley, the former assistant administrator for the PPL at USAID, Bambi Ariano, who formerly was the counselor at USAID, Ambassador John Simon, former executive president at OPIC and U.S. ambassador to the AU, Michelle Semelis, the former chief of staff at USAID, and Nilmani Rubin, a former senior advisor to the House Foreign Affairs Committee. So thanks for serving on the task force and being here with us today. Before we get started with the panel, I wanted to maybe back up just a little bit and just sort of go back to why we did this and why this was so important. And I think there were sort of three main reasons why we saw this as needed. One, at a think tank, what is our main purpose? And I think Dan has always put this very eloquently when he said, sometimes what we're here to do is to stop stupid stuff from happening. And I think very much that's what we're trying to do with this report. The second reason, though, flows from that, and you can't fight something with nothing, and you can't say that there isn't something out there now. And I know we're not the only ones who have done this. We do not pretend to have a monopoly on good thoughts, but I think it's particularly important for an institution like CSIS, with its deep defense and national security background, to make such a strong statement on the importance of development to broader U.S. foreign policy objectives. And the final reason is we really should see this as more of an opportunity as opposed to a challenge. This is an opportunity to correct the issues that exist. I think Senator Young did a very good job of explaining what the U.S. foreign assistance system looks like right now and the need for reform. We shouldn't just say that we're happy with the status quo. We can make targeted reforms, and that may involve some targeted reorganization. So I really do think that, first and foremost, we saw this as an opportunity as opposed to a challenge. So I think with that, we'll turn to the panelists and get the conversation started. Nilmani, I know you have to scoot early, so maybe I'll start with you if that's okay. Obviously you spent a lot of time on the Hill, and this was a congressional co-chair, or congressional task force. From your perspective and your time up on the Hill, what role do you see Congress playing, and how could Congress go on in a constructive offense as opposed to just defense on these issues?
Thanks, Connor, for that question, and thanks to all of you for being here and caring about foreign assistance. Congress has a key role in shaping foreign aid. Congress is the continuity of government. I mean, at most, an administration has 8 years. But you've seen congressmen serving for, John Dingell for 59 years and Robert Byrd for 57 years. So I'm sure you have a lot of years ahead of you, Senator Young. But Congress can affect change and see that it lasts for long periods of time. So it's really important. Congress sets the rules for foreign aid. And that is something that's going to be very important. And it has the power of the purse through authorizations and appropriations. Congress is already starting with the first step, the young Shaheen bill that calling for a strategy is exactly what should be done first. We should have a strategy on what we want foreign assistance to achieve, and then we should think about the most cost-effective ways to do that. So you're starting with the right step. But if that bill doesn't get passed into law, there are other ways that could be affected, whether it's an amendment to other bills or integrated into appropriations or letters or through meetings or there's a lot of ways that Congress could really push for that strategy to be done first. Congress, as Senator Young already mentioned, is holding hearings related to foreign aid, but they could do more. They could do a series on foreign assistance reform and have roundtables bringing in different actors that don't normally get to the table to talk about foreign assistance. Those things don't need to be done in D.C. They could be done in districts to really show the impact of foreign aid on the world and on the United States. This is important because foreign aid helps the U.S. too. If you look at just the Power Africa initiative, it's leveraged $14.5 billion from the private sector and has 64 partners in 22 states and has helped create thousands of jobs in the United States, and that's just one program. Foreign aid has massive economic impacts on the U.S., so it's important to take that back home and not just do it here in the Capitol. And then perhaps the most important tool is back to the power of the purse. So Congress being more explicit on what it wants its funds to be used for, and then calling them to account. The president's budget, as people on the Hill like to say, it's a suggestion. So it's Congress that really can make it clear that they want the money spent in certain ways, and they can require the administration to spend that money. Once money is appropriated, if the administration doesn't want to spend it, they have to go through this process called rescission, and they have to send a request to the Hill. And if the Hill doesn't pass legislation supporting that request, the administration still has to spend the money. And so you know how hard it is to get things passed through Congress these days. Like the idea that a rescission request would get passed into law is it's a hard sell. So those are some concrete things that Congress can do.
Thanks, Nomadi. Maybe I'd just push a little bit. You spent, while you were up there most recently working for Chairman Royce, you had some success with Electrify Africa and some other legislative initiatives. Maybe you can give us a sense of how difficult it is to push, or what it's like to move something like that through the process, so that we have an idea of what Senator Young and others are going to be facing.
So Chairman Royce has been successful, and I had the pleasure of working for Senator Lugar on Senate Foreign Relations before that, and they've both been successful in getting things through when they've built coalitions. And so if you look at things that we care about foreign assistance, it's moving bills through. It's not just the other people who care about foreign assistance. It's Electrify Africa had support from U.S. Global Leadership Campaign, as well as the One campaign, right, that care about foreign aid. But we also had letters of support from the Pediatricians Association, from Americans for Taxpayer Reform, which cares about good use of taxpayer funds. We worked with environmental groups, the Nature Conservancy, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce that sees the economic benefits to it. So there was just a large coalition of people from different groups, and you think members aren't going to have time to read every single word in the bill, but if they look at the one-pager with the logos and they see groups that they are aligned with, that's going to help win them over. And those groups, like the National Rural Electric Cooperatives Association, they have members all across America in states that people don't always realize actually do care about foreign aid, and they can bring out their members to support the bills. So I think it's building an unusual coalition of groups that have people in districts and in states that can activate is really key.
Thanks, Nilmani. I appreciate that. Susan, maybe we'll go to you now. One of the other reasons why I think we wanted to do this task force was there seemed to be the potential that there might be a full-blown merger between USAID and the State Department. And there was a general sense shared amongst task force members that that was probably not an optimal outcome. It does seem like that's more than likely not going to happen. Deputy Secretary Sullivan, in his testimony, indicated that that was not on the table. But there may be still a desire to try to maybe do something, a more thinly veiled attempt to bring the two institutions closer together by linking a lot of the backroom functions that Dan mentioned, the less sexy things, the HR, the procurement IT and such. But this has happened before. Can you maybe talk a little bit about what happened then and what the outcome was?
Yes, thank you, Connor. And first, I want to thank Senator Young for being here, for all of your support, and Senator Sheehan and your staff have been absolutely outstanding over the last 2 months as CSIS and Connor, Dan, and Earl have moved this incredible group at a rapid pace. I have to say, I felt really privileged to be part of this group because I had just retired from the Foreign Service after 25 years, only days before this task force was formed. And so it gave me an opportunity to be with old friends and colleagues and to talk about these issues in a different environment. And just listening to it was just talked about the importance of what we do and how it impacts people on the ground. I had to just take a moment to reflect on, I was in charge of our Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance Bureau when the Haiti earthquake occurred. And we found at that time in January 2010, more people gave to the Haiti earthquake relief than watched the Super Bowl that year. And they were able to do that because of many people in this room. I'm looking around and I'm seeing many of my colleagues who, when that happened, they all of a sudden said, we have to respond. And we have to not only respond as a country, but also because of the American people's will in order to do something in order to make other people's lives better. And we're fortunate because we have the infrastructure within USAID and within our colleagues of the State Department in order to do that. So I just wanted to make that point at the top before they asked me to talk about something a little less sexy, as Dan and Connor have taught it, which is really about the backroom operations. It's about what we do and the support we need in order to get out there and deliver for the American people. And so while we talk about the 3 Ds and what is different, you're correct. We've revisited this issue of state and USAID redesign and reorganization actually many times. But what I think is different now than other times in my career is that development is really seen as a discipline. It is truly understood as to do development, you have to understand the basics of how do you actually deliver in a targeted way to achieve real results, monitor the effectiveness of what we do, and most importantly, deliver for the American people and the American taxpayer. And so that backdrop, as we look at the national security strategy, as was talked about, over the last 20 years, we have always said development, diplomacy, and defense are the 3 Ds. They are the 3 pillars. But why is it so important then to invest in our backroom operations as we move forward? So I'm going to give 3 examples and 3 studies I really hope that the new team at State and USAID look at as they begin the redesign effort. The first one has to do with actually IT. And you think, well, how interesting can IT be? Why does it matter that USAID has an IT platform that enables us to really engage in the field? Well, when we talk about the field as development professionals, we don't mean just being in the embassy or being in the major capitals. We talk about being out there, as I was when I was in Colombia as the mission director. And often I was in places where the only way out there were two ways. One was the airstrip, and if you had the plane to take you out, but the second was also the internet connection. And because of our IT platform, we were able to connect to the home office and to really make real change. So when the last time we looked at this was actually the Information Technology and Transformation Initiative, the ITTI study. And I really recommend everybody who's looking at redesign, look at the 2012 ITTI study that came out as a result of a state USAID steering committee led by the USAID administrator as well as the Deputy Secretary of State. And what we found is we tried to merge IT systems. Actually, we were not saving US taxpayer dollars because we in USAID, sorry, I still say we after 2 months, is that we really need to work on a Google platform. We need to be able to download documents, be able to connect. And I'll give you an example. When our team was in Peru and working with the indigenous communities in Peru, we were working on the reform of a major forestry law. Obviously, that was within the national security interests of the United States. We felt it was important to get behind this. Well, the indigenous communities did not have access to the internet. They did not have access to the latest draft laws. They did not have access to the impact analysis that our incredible partners were providing on a daily basis. But because our team was deployed, was working on a Google platform, we were able to do this. That's just one example, Connor, of how being able to have our own systems makes a difference. A second example is with personnel. Often we talk about the Foreign Service as one foreign service, and we actually have very different personnel systems within state and USAID. I chose to be part of the USAID Foreign Service system when I came in 25 years ago because I wanted to execute development. I have tremendous respect with my diplomatic friends who I've served with over the years. But the difference is we recruit people with technical skills, and today more so than ever as we see the development discipline flourishing on our campuses and colleges and universities. And so we're recruiting people only with master's degrees, with incredible expertise in everything from global health policy, which is fundamental in today's world, to economists, to human-centered design, expertise that we need in order to deliver, again, for the American people. The State Department Foreign Service, understandably, is recruiting a different type of officer. They need generalists. They need extremely brilliant professionals who can come in and pass the exam. We have different foreign service systems not only because of who we recruit, but most importantly because of where we work. Many of you probably saw in the Washington Post yesterday the 5 myths of the Foreign Service. It was outstanding. It talked about how 27 countries, I believe, are where officers are serving, receive danger pay, the hardship posts that we serve in. Well, that was out of 170 countries where the State Department serves. We only serve in 80, and those 80, we're not in London, we're not in Singapore, we're not in Buenos Aires. So the support systems that our FSOs are, and not just our FSOs, I'd say all of the people of USAID, whether they're from the civil service or all the 30 different mechanisms we hire, if you're working on Syria from Washington, you're going through some very difficult challenges as you support our people on the front lines. So the second recommendation I would make for the redesign group is please look at our stress and resilience report from 2015. It has some outstanding recommendations of how we should be supporting our people, not only in the field, but those back in Washington who are trying to deliver for the American people. The last example, Connor, I know we have to move on, but I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the largest part of our workforce, which is often not thought about. And as we think about delivering, it's our Foreign Service nationals. They are the most talented professionals that we are fortunate to work with. And we work with them differently than our colleagues in the State Department because these are lawyers, they are Supreme Court justices, engineers. I've worked with nuclear physicists. They are the creme de la creme that in order to deliver on sustainable development has to be locally owned. We don't work in classified space in USAID. We literally work in partnership. And so merging, if there's any discussion of merging the two systems, it would actually end up diminishing their role, and also we wouldn't have the results and we wouldn't be able to affect the change that we need to affect in the challenges that we have now. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. No, and I mean, I think it's good for a cheap laugh to say that this stuff isn't sexy, but it really, I think, coming away from the task force, it's critical to a well-functioning institution, and, it's an area where we really do need to be careful about. Michelle, one of the issues that came up throughout our task force meetings was the idea that there are a lot of duplicative programs across the USAID architecture, and when you have 20 agencies engaged in it, many of them are working in the same areas. And one of the things that we were also trying to look at was, are there areas where we can find savings? If savings are the sort of order of the day, where could we potentially find savings? Could you talk a little bit about where you see duplication in U.S. foreign assistance and how we might be able to, we obviously make recommendations about this in the report, but if you could talk a little bit more about, how we might get at some of these duplications to generate savings.
So this is one of those questions where I can answer it directly, and then my email will start blowing up by different people who I called out.
Gave you the easy question.
Yes, I appreciate that. Or I can maybe talk about a few principles and then some experience, and we can go from there, although I do have ideas if people want them offline. I want to first thank Dan and CSIS. I mean, the 4th of July, reviewing the third draft of the report was not exactly what I was hoping to do, but, we all did it. We provided comments. I want to thank Senator Young and Shaheen for all that you're doing. I think this is where the rubber will hit the road, and then all my fellow task force members. I think when I think about this question, I think about all my relatives out there who are paying taxes every day, and what they would want to make sure we were doing was making sure that any program that we're supporting is as efficient and effective as possible. And that sounds very cliche, but I think it's really important. And the way that I think about this is I think that the Coordinator for Foreign Assistance really needs to think about what is the outcome we're trying to achieve and which agency is best equipped to do it. And I think over the last 10 years, maybe 15 years, as you mentioned, over 20 agencies have started to become involved because it's fun to do international assistance work. It's really interesting. There are different environments, there are different ways of testing things, and people have been able to do it. But I think we're at a point in our evolution where we really need to look at the programs that we're trying to achieve and what those outcomes should be. I think the other thing we will need is some discipline from Congress, because members of Congress love to put directives into congressional appropriations bills telling different agencies to do different things. I was on the Appropriations Committee for almost 5 years. I know exactly how this goes, but agencies are given license to go to do a different program, and then they use that as, well, I was told to be here. I think that the way we should evaluate things is really make sure that programs that are being done in country are led by country needs. And those needs need to be translated to the U.S. government through the ambassador, and he or she needs to be very clear about what are our objectives in that country. And if something doesn't fit, then they need to say, no, thank you. There's so many times I've been to an embassy and ambassadors say, well, but HHS was here and they said they had money, and so we said, of course they can come. And when asked whether it fits within the strategic plan for that country, well, not really, but they had money and we didn't, and we thought we'd try to make it work. I think we need to be much more disciplined about how we move forward. The last thing I would say is that when I was at USAID, I was lucky enough to work through 2 selectivity and focus efforts with Susan. And, we had very clear criteria, and we had different tiers of programs and countries that should be eliminated, and here's why, and we could phase in, we could phase out. I see other colleagues shaking their head. We did memos. I mean, we must have revised so many memos so many times to make people feel better about how we talked about it. And we made very tough recommendations, and we suggested the closure and elimination of programs in probably a dozen countries each time. But the number of people who actually made the hard choice to shut those programs down, you could count on one hand. People were pressured by interest groups. They were pressured by congressional staff who really liked a program. They were pressured by ambassadors who said, how could you get rid of my aid program? This is all going to require really tough choices, and it doesn't make you popular, which means most people don't want to do it. But I encourage people to have clear direction in mind, know why they're doing it, and be able to stand behind that, and then clear choices can be made. Thank you, Connor.
Thanks, Michelle. One of the things that I think we all sort of saw in this was that a lot of people know what needs to be done, or there's been a lot of proposals, and I don't think that anything, I wouldn't say that this report is necessarily groundbreaking in terms of the recommendations that we make, but I think you hit on a good point, the tough choices part. I mean, from your perspective, from your experience, what is needed to get over those, to make those tough choices? Who needs to provide that level of leadership? Or is it a question of leadership?
We've had so many strong leaders at USAID. I mean, we've had Andrew Natsios, we had Raj Shah, you had Gail Smith, you had others. People are strong leaders, but when they don't have the backing, whether it's backing from Congress because a member says, no, you have to do my program, or it's backing from the community that says, I've been working in this sector for 25 years, how could you stop me from doing it? It just, all those forces come on to an administrator and a leadership team, and it's really hard to push back against it. So you're absolutely right. Having served in the front office at USAID for almost 4.5 years, we knew exactly what needed to be done, but when you don't have the support externally or internally, because the internal advocates are probably even stronger than the external advocates at times. And I'm not saying people shouldn't advocate for what they believe in. I've been an advocate for 20 years for foreign assistance, but I think it's at some point we have to decide, what is the goal, what is the purpose, and what is effective. There's so many programs that make us feel good, and they look good, and you get good pictures, but it doesn't make a long-term difference. And I know that's hard to say, but it's important. And I think in this time of shrinking budgets, we need to make the right choices, because it's so easy to make easy choices. But you might end up cutting things you wish you hadn't because you weren't willing to take the lump that was going to come with the choice.
Thanks, Michelle. That's really good. No, maybe just, Nilmini, I don't want to belabor this point on tough choices, but could you maybe provide a perspective from your days in Congress in terms of the ability to do these, to make these decisions about shutting down, and how Congress could play a more constructive role, or maybe that's not the...
Well, so thinking about if I'm the aid administrator, I'm getting pressured by a congressman to keep a project that doesn't make sense anymore. You kind of think about, well, what's the next step? It's either I fold to that member who's pushing something that doesn't make sense, or I think about who thinks it makes sense to cut it and work with them. There might be other people on the Hill that agree that it should be cut, so engaging with those people and have them either weigh in directly with the member that's putting on pressure, or weigh in other ways more publicly to get that member to do that, to think about, who can write letters to the editor criticizing that member for trying to keep something that's a waste of taxpayer money. Like, I'm sure that there are people that are teed up for that. So I think it's sort of thinking through kind of like, what are the next steps to push back on stuff that doesn't make sense, because there is a constituency of people that want to do aid in the right way. And so I think together we can get that.
Great, thanks, Nilmini. Bambi, why don't I turn to you? I mean, one of the other premises I think we came at from this is we are seeing a changing world, and and that means we need to think about how we do our development assistance, and where we do our development assistance, and how we are deploying our resources. And I think one of the areas where the U.S. is going to be doing a whole lot more soon is, or more than we already do, is in fragile and post-conflict states. What do we need to do to improve our ability? And you obviously had experience in Afghanistan, and we've had this experience over the past 15 years there and in Iraq. And what do we need to do to be more effective in these environments?
Yeah, thanks, Connor. A very easy question, right? Yeah, another easy question. I'd just like to thank everybody who's here today, and really look forward to the questions, because I'm assuming all of you are here because you have concerns and want to be able to express them. I'd like to talk about three things I think we have learned in conflict, post-conflict, fragility environments, particularly since 9/11. But even I worked in the the Andes for a long time in programs that were dealing with counter-drug issues. And, I think one of the things we did learn about when you tie development to national security, the Washington field interface really becomes more and more essential. I felt this when I was working as mission director in Baghdad, 2 a.m. Video conferences, with the ambassador, none of us having slept, but nobody in Washington could do it until really late in the afternoon here. And, you just really felt the intensity of that Washington field linkage growing. And I know that's true for all programs, but I think in the conflict, post-conflict, for fragile states environment, that is increasingly an issue. So that's something we really need to get right. I saw real progress on that between Baghdad in 2006 and 2007, to Iraq and to Afghanistan 2012, 2013. I think we had improved on that. I will also talk about, why that's still an issue. The other thing that I found was that in these very, very high-profile environments, the level of scrutiny is so intense. And as a result of that, very often foreign assistance in general gets labeled, gets categorized based on whether USAID or State Department or others can perform in these high voltage environments. It's almost like the rest of the world fades away, and that becomes the issue. So it's extremely important that we get that right, just given the level of scrutiny those programs come under. And the third thing I think we all learned or have learned is that we need to spend less time coordinating with each other and more time out there getting it done and done in the right way. I think post 9/11, Michelle, you said it was this come one, come all to every agency in the world. We've got to, we have to be at the table. And what I think we did find was that we were spending, and still are spending probably, an inordinate amount of time coordinating with each other. We have got to get those coordinating structures streamlined and correct. So then I'll go into three things that I think about. I'm now retired, so I can think lofty thoughts and speak honestly. I do think we need to really simplify and streamline our coordination structures, as I mentioned. To mix a metaphor, or to mix two metaphors, there simply are too many cooks at the table in these high voltage environments. There's been improvement. In Baghdad, as we were preparing for the surge, we were meeting in a room that was probably 3 times the size of this, and country team had, on some good days, over 100 people sitting at the table. It was a very, very long table that Saddam Hussein had used for something. I have no idea what he used it for. By the time I got to Iraq, which was 6, 7 years later, country team really was a much more efficient structure. The authority of the ambassador over what went on, the military-civilian relationship at country team was just much smoother. But we need to avoid the overly cumbersome and just what is outright dysfunctional, and come up with a way that is viable. Ultimately, what is required in these environments is flexibility, because things turn on a dime. And especially when you're working with the military, and in most of these environments, there is a very, very heavy national security overlay. It requires a real ability to turn things quickly. When you have so many actors and there's so many interests and so many stakeholders, very often it becomes almost impossible to do that. And then you're judged because of your lack of flexibility and your inability to perform. That gets to the issue of realistic goal setting. In these environments, very often success is not defined by development assistance. Success is defined by some other level of strategic goal or interest that is not always, does not always place development front and center. Development is seen as a corollary, a contributor, etc. This means that development, because of this scrutiny and because of the intensity of the scrutiny, our development programs really need to be very tightly focused, very clearly defined, and above all, we need to be able to deliver on what we say we're going to, so that realistic goal setting becomes paramount. And third, and this builds on something Susan and Michelle also said, I'd like to put in a plug for leadership and management. These environments require intensely tactical leadership and management. Development strategy needs to be part of your DNA when you come into places like this. But the leadership and the management need to be very, very tactical and very practical on a day-to-day basis. And what this means is you have to be able to communicate seamlessly. You are going to have high in-country visibility, which means you need to take great care to take care of your people. Your focus needs to be on your people, and you need to have time to do that. Again, this gets back to the issue of time management and allowing leaders and managers in these environments to be able to use their time wisely and not having to spend too much time managing things that really don't contribute to the mission on the ground. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Bambi. That was great. No, really. John, thanks for being here today. You were Executive Vice President at OPIC, amongst a number of other jobs. You're in the impact investing space now. One of the other issues that I think we're grappling with is the growing role of the private sector, the shift in resource flows. USAID's done a very good job at public-private partnerships over the past 15 years or so. What role do you see for the private sector? How is it moving beyond just simply public-private partnerships, and what does that mean for this discussion we're having here today?
Thanks, Connor, and I'd like to add my gratitude to those expressed by the panel, to you and the team, to Dan and Errol for a really high-quality report, and to Senators Young and Shaheen for supporting this very critical initiative at a very important time. When I think about the role that the private sector has to play in development, I really see four critical aspects that are key. The one that I think everyone recognizes, and I think Nilmani mentioned it in her remarks, is the leverage factor. So to the extent that we are in a time, I had the pleasure of serving in government and in development when we were seeing the most massive increases in development spending since the Marshall Plan, and that was really great. We had lots of money to do lots of very important things, and I think we did some things that made a really big difference. But those days, I think it's fair to say, no matter what happens with the budget proposal put out by the White House, are over. And we're looking at an era of certainly flat, if not diminishing, public resources for development. So to compensate for that, we really need to look to the private sector to help leverage those things that can be leveraged. And not everything you do in development can be leveraged. A lot of things that Bambi was working on in Afghanistan and Iraq, you're not going to get a lot of private investors into, although when I was at OPIC, we did get some private investment money into parts of Iraq. But it's difficult to get private investment money into those types of situations. But to the extent you need resources there, you can look at other places where you are spending aid dollars and think about how you can leverage those with private sector dollars. And of course, Electrify Africa is a case in point, where the vast majority of that money is there was some aid money that's in the piece, but and nobody can give me the numbers, but by 10, 20, maybe 100 times, most of the money there is private sector money. And I think it's important to recognize there are different types of leverage. I mean, there's a lot of the leverage that Dan, when he was at the Global Development Alliance, sort of stimulated at the outset of the PPPs that you talked about, where you looked for philanthropic money to supplement and match USAID grant dollars. And now I think we need to look, especially with the advent of impact investing, to find investment dollars that can tap into a pool that is infinitely larger. Infinitely is probably a wrong word, but there are $100 trillion of assets around the world available for investment that is, massively larger than what's available for grant funding. So leverage is a key point. But there are three others that I think are worth spending some time on. The second is really market signals. So one challenge in development is you try and fulfill, you have a strategy, you're trying to implement it, you have an idea of what will work. And of course, once that's gone through the government process of approving a strategy, it's very tough to change that, despite what's happening on the ground. If you're working with a private partner, and that private partner is not seeing the success that can justify their continuing investment, you get that market signal, and then you're, in essence, forced to adjust to the reality on the ground. When I was at the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, we had a partnership with USAID called the African Entrepreneurship Facility, where we took some AID money and paired it with OPIC-approved projects to help really to help the entrepreneurs apply for OPIC-approved projects and succeed. And the benefit there is that the projects couldn't go forward if they couldn't meet the underwriting analysis that we were able to do at OPIC. And ultimately, we're able to attract the private sector capital that's required for an OPIC investment to go through. So basically, you had USAID grant dollars that leveraged private investment and OPIC investment to help get a project off the ground. And if that funding wasn't forthcoming, you wouldn't spend the AID funding. It's a small program, but I think finding ways that you can get a market signal into the program is a critical component that the private sector adds. The third area, and this actually does apply to some of the conflict areas and several situations that are post-conflict, but still in areas that I think Douglas North would call limited access order environments. It's situations where you have a public sector that's really not designed to serve the public good. That happens probably more often than we'd like to see in developing countries. Also happens sometimes in the developed world. But the point is, in those types of environments, if we can work through the local private sector, you can build up a capacity to get things done that perhaps can't be done through purely public agencies or public mechanisms. And of course, in that situation, you're not just talking about the local for-profit sector, you're also talking about the local not-for-profit sector that's able to provide those opportunities. And one area that we've spent a lot of time with in the impact investing sector is health. And healthcare, working through health ministries in some of the countries where we've been involved in, is a very tough proposition. And you have significant issues with leakage in many, many health industries. On the other hand, you have in Africa, for instance, 50% of the care is delivered through the private sector. It's a very fragmented, underfunded, undercapitalized private sector, but it's a engine through which you can deliver services. And if you can create investment mechanisms that can do that, you can actually get the services out to the people without going through perhaps a very leaky public system. And the last area where private sector I think has real value is really when you think about graduation. So one initiative that I was very involved in was Millennium Challenge Corporation. And the Millennium Challenge Corporation sort of created a somewhat of a deal, in my mind, with Congress, which was, look, give us a bit more freedom and a bit more latitude to implement programs, and we'll be held accountable for results. And the accountability is, do these countries begin to move towards more of a graduation model of assistance? Well, there's a long distance between where a country that's an MCC country is and where a developed country has to be. And somewhere along the way, the private sector could come in and pick up some of the slack for what grant funding can no longer do. And I think if we think about development as a ladder, where you have countries, the type of countries Bambi worked in, which are a long, long way from being able to attract a lot of private investment, or at least private investment across the board, if not in specific sectors. And there, the idea is to get to a point where they're able to at least have some sort of functioning government services and government infrastructure that could potentially apply for and attract an MCC-type compact, or at least even think about that. You have the vast majority, I think, developing countries where MCC would be the top of the class. You have MCC, and then you have private investment as a driver. And I think private investment is happening all along those chains in different ways. But ultimately, the large pool of private capital will come when a country can establish itself as an attractive place to invest capital. And that's part of what should be our outcome metric, our success metric for our development, is can we get countries to that point?
Thanks, John. This issue of graduation, it came up a little bit. Maybe this is something I'd like to hear from all the folks on the panel on is, are we, is the system thinking enough about graduation? Are we thinking enough about it? What do we need to do to what do we need to do to get closer to graduation in some of these countries and to better embed it within the system, I think would be the question. And John, I'd welcome your thoughts, and I'd welcome everybody else's thoughts on this
I
too.
want to build a little bit on what Bambi said about realistic goals. And I think it's important that graduation is something that should be the end point that we hope for every country, but along the way we have to think about what are the realistic targets. And so I think if you create a dynamic where you're, say, going into any country, our plan at some point is get to a point where this country no longer is requires foreign aid. Ideally is a country like South Korea that has a very robust aid program of its own. That's the goal. But we have to see where we are and start, which rung do we go? So do we go from a situation where there's almost no functional provision of public services, and do we get to something where we can at least clean the streets and deliver a decent, collect taxes and do really the basics? Are you in a situation where you can look to do a little bit more than that? Are you in a situation where you can look to do large-scale infrastructure projects, attract private investment, and all of those things? And I think if you think about having differentiated strategies based on where countries are on that spectrum and apply the appropriate tools for each of those strategies, I think you can get there. I think it is not realistic to presume that graduation is an option for every country, or to set a timetable for graduation that is not decades long, if not more in some instances.
Susan, maybe you could reflect a little bit on this graduation
How
idea.
did you know
Thanks,
I
John.
was ready to jump in?
No,
So
I could see
I agree with all of John's points, but I want to go back to what Michelle said, and I think it's the political aspect of this, because it's something that we haven't just struggled with over the last couple years. In my 25 years, I remember under the previous administration, Ambassador Jim Michaels here nodding his head, he remembers under the Clinton administration where we closed out and we graduated countries, a term that I'm not very fond of. And it's really about, at this point, reflecting how do we change the relationship with these countries? How do we really change it into partnership, from patronage to partnership? And something that I think we've all worked very hard on so that they can be, as John said, on the cusp of how do we prepare them for, it's really a relationship with the private sector. Our role as, whether we're diplomats or development professionals, it's actually convening the right people around the table so that ultimately those countries can make the investments that they want to make with the private sector, as we just talked about at the top of the hour, is obviously the greatest infusion of foreign direct investment in these countries. But that requires political will, and I will not name the country, but just even a year ago, I had an ambassador calling me saying, how can you change the status of a U.S. aid mission to an office, which ultimately leads to a partnership, because if you do that, it downgrades my country. So we really have to deal with the political realities of this and make sure that everybody understands it's in our advantage as a country in order to change that relationship to a true partnership.
Thanks, Susan. Yeah, I think we're going to go to audience Q&A now. I think we've got a lot of smart people here, and rather than me prattling on further, and Dan's going to help moderate this Q&A session.
Thanks. I'm good at that.
You're very
okay,
good, Dan.
Good. I want to hear from Liz Schreier. I want to hear from David Berteau, and I want to hear from Larry Cooley. Liz.
So Liz.
I didn't know I didn't know I was going to be called. So
This is how our task force meetings went.
So
right?
first, hats off. This is Power Panel, Power Report, phenomenal. So here's a question. I look back, if we were here a year ago, there was kind of one voice on our topic, reform and reorg, and now this is a contribution that now there's like a half a dozen of conversation about here. And I was at a meeting over in the administration last week, and I said all of the reports kind of come together around the same topic, that development's really important, and these reports range from some that say development, everything in the entire administration should be kind of put into state. This goes to your comment, and to another extreme, which says everything in the administration should go into USAID. And this report, I think, comes out where there's a lot of consensus when I talk to people, which says USAID and the administrator should really be the premier head voice of development. And what really needs to be tweaked and fixed is there's a whole bunch of programs out there that would be more efficient if you pull them in and bring them in. Maybe not everything like some of the ideas out there, but that we should bring them in to make them more effective and efficient. I think what a lot of the panelists have said today. And what it feels like is that the administration, who is looking to find efficiencies and effectiveness, what we've all talked about, what Senator Young said, that we want them to wrap their arms around, can spend the next, almost a little under 4 years trying to fight a battle that they may or may not win, or they can look to do what all of you, I think, are talking about and what this task force is saying, which is to try to fix some of these efficiencies that people have been looking to do for a long time, and to try to do some things where there is this consensus both on Democrats and Republicans on Capitol Hill, what a lot of people in this room have been doing for a long time. And my question is, am I right in that there is this sweet spot of this consensus of putting the USAID administrator in this powerful development voice? That's where the consensus is, trying to draw some of these inefficiencies that have been, for lots of different reasons that all of you have mentioned, into this consensus. So where there are lots of these reports out there, that there is this consensus sweet spot, but it requires to have an emboldened leader. We need to, a lot of us have been working, get Mark Green over that finish line. I'm sorry that the senator left because he's been amazing at doing it, but we all need to get McConnell and Schumer to get their act together with the White House and get him over the finish line quickly before the August recess so he can be part of these discussions. And so that's my question. Is there a consensus? Is this the sweet spot that what the CSIS report is saying, and does it require an emboldened leader that can have a seat at this table and help really be a voice? Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to bunch these together. So I want to hear from David, and then Larry, and then I'll have the panelists respond.
All right, David Berto, Professional Services Council. I thought I came with more answers than questions, so I had to struggle here. Thank you, Dan. I have a question as much for John as anybody else. I really like what you say about attracting capital and having it be, there's a graduation level where, in fact, a country gets to the point where it's good return on investment. But increasingly, I'm concerned because the global financial markets are moving more and more towards a short-term focus in terms of return, and the kinds of issues we're wrestling with here tend to get longer term than any of us ever thought when we were young people first getting into this business. So how do we reconcile that, what I consider to be a growing gap between the short-term demands of the financial markets and the long-term demands of real development?
Imagine my surprise. For a long time, at least in my opinion, our community's been on defense. And it's a very awkward position to be because it feels like we're trying to stave off bad things from happening, to kind of piggyback on Dan's formulation. I think the challenge that was thrown out is the right challenge, which is to try and figure out how to take advantage of a moment where change is happening with, around, and in some cases through us, and where the world we're inheriting is clearly different than the one we had before. And the challenge is to get off our back foot. And to me, still, the things that I'm reading, I think this is, to my taste, the best of them that's come forward so far on this. But all of them still feel to me like defense. And so I was particularly pleased to hear this conversation about strategy and what the U.S. really stands to gain from foreign assistance and why we believe in it and why it matters, as a way to try and move from the back foot to the front foot. And I'm wondering about the panel's thoughts about how to continue that trajectory. I mean, what would it really take to try and pull together a forceful consensus of people that does not feel like trying to defend something that was, but really tries to make the best case for something that might be?
What's the reward for good work? It's more work, right, Larry? So I agree with you. So, okay, so I'd love to hear from the panelists.
Do you want to start?
Yeah, on the consensus of the administrator's role and that forceful voice, it's very hard to tell when you've been so intensely involved inside an agency. I guess what I would say is I think we're as close to that as we've been, at least since I joined USAID. I served with the agency during a 30-year period that was very, very tenuous and very challenging and difficult. I would say that the experience today has shown that the agency is still living and breathing. It's out there doing its programs. And there is definitely an understanding. I know when the decision was made to withdraw the troops from Afghanistan, and you had this massive development foreign assistance focus there, and suddenly every agency, as the troops left, every other agency, with the exception of USAID and a couple of others, were also leaving. The security conditions did not permit it, et cetera. So I think there is an understanding today that you do need the development piece, and it will be sustained. I think the military has always been one of the greatest supporters of that. They know they're intensely short-term, and they will be gone on a dime, and something has to stay behind. So I think that I think there is consensus on the importance of that. It's very complicated, and aid really is going to have to step up in ways that perhaps we have not. The short-term, long-term gap on the financial side, I think we've seen this over the years. I remember looking at, John, the types of things you were talking about with OPIC in Cairo, trying to negotiate, trying to bring the private sector into the tent, but the private sector literally had a 6-month bottom line they wanted to achieve, and were willing to go only so far to the extent. So I think there's a lot of education that needs to happen on both sides as to the risks implicit in working in some of these environments. And it's not just the high conflict risk environments, it's every single environment where capital is just going to be more at risk. The offense defense, Larry, I think you're right on that. But I think there's a reason for that. I think we need to be very, very careful that we don't get too, poetic in the way we express things, which I think that some of our pronouncements in terms of the role of development have bordered on hyperbole in the past. We need to be very specific, very concrete, and very targeted in terms of how development has changed and the role it really plays in a much more complex world. So I think there is a tentativeness, maybe moving toward the offense. I don't know, you've got a mediocre quarterback, but that's, don't think you've got a good quarterback. So, even though you have a good quarterback, but I think even the good quarterback needs to be careful of hyperbole, so.
Okay, well, I could easily carry on the sports metaphors, as many of you know in the room, but I won't. So getting to Liz's point about the consensus, and I think it comes down to one word, and it's we're all ready for one person to be accountable. We need accountability. What has been so hard for all of us who have been working in the foreign assistance and development area for so long is that there are so many different agencies and departments that are involved. And as Bambi said, in the end, they eventually all leave, and we're still there. And so having the U.S. aid administrator who is literally accountable for all those elements and synchronizing and sequencing them in order to achieve our objectives is absolutely fundamental. And I think that's the consensus right now is let's have one level of accountability, which should appeal. The second point about short-term, long-term, thank you very much for asking that, because actually in my new life, I'm so fortunate to be the president of the International Youth Foundation with Bill Reese, who's over there. And one of the things that I've been introduced to, I always talked about public-private partnerships, being a U.S. government official. It's completely different when you're actually doing it, because they are looking at short-term long-term bottom line. And so as we talk about the increase of FDI into these countries from the private sector, how do we help them achieve their goals as well as achieve really the goals of the U.S. government and national security? And Larry, I love your point about we've always been on the defense. I mean, even I was outside of USAID for about 2 years when I was a Foreign Service officer, and it was so interesting to see the perspective, see our agency from a different perspective, because I felt like we were always in a crouching position. And as I talked about our agency today, or just development professionals, all of you in the room, you know, it is a discipline. It is a very strong discipline, and we need to take that and we need to run with that because it is within our national security interests.
So I'll try to be really quick. I think I'm going to build on what you said, having one person be accountable, but also having one set of goals that are the USG goals, and we're all working towards those. I'll be a little bit of a wet blanket and just say I think we have to be careful. I know I said it, but around efficiency and effectiveness. When I was at USAID, we tried to find efficiencies, and we made these assertions we were going to save hundreds of millions of dollars, and everyone remembers them. There's not $100 million, hundreds of millions of dollars of efficiency in the system. So you may find some, and eliminating some programs will get you some resources. But I actually think it's about being effective and being, as you said, accountable. So setting clear goals with clear expectations. I want to, on this, is super important. And I think two other things. On working with the private sector, I think USAID and the USG in general, we need new tools. And we need to do what Susan just said, is we need to understand what their needs are and what their expectations are, and then we need to support from underneath. So I remember we were working on a project at USAID where we were working with a private company. They wanted to do something, but the ROI wasn't good enough for them, so we were going to give them a couple $100 million to support them. And it just felt too private sector-y for government people, and they got nervous, and we pulled out. And, you know, I understand why, and the PR could have been really bad, but I think it really would have made a difference to where we were working, and it would have been a new way of thinking, and it would have brought private sector partners to us in a new way. And then the last thing I would say is I think it's time for us to go on the offense. I think we have been, you know, we have real successes, and PEPFAR has really good numbers and good expectations. Feed the Future has really good numbers. The stunting numbers are amazing. Ebola, I mean, it's no longer there. But what happens is we get kicked off our we get pushed backwards when there's a bad press story, and we huddle and we say, oh no. But you know, the point is that when you're doing development, conditions change. And so you thought that this agriculture program was going to work, and then there was a tsunami, and then things went away. But we spend too much time trying to explain away everything, and not enough time just saying, you know what, we did our best, we achieved these results, and you know, they're changing circumstances. So I think it's time to go on the offensive, and we have to, or else we're going to have a problem.
Yeah, so the benefit of being last in this row is I get to build on all these great comments before me, which is really great. One thing I'd say, you know, just last week a report came out, a very academic study on the President's Malaria Initiative, and identified 1.7 million lives attributable to that initiative alone in terms of that were saved. And that's, again, just one piece of a big part of what was said. To Susan's point about accountability, I absolutely believe that among our group, and it was a very diverse group, I think that is the best word to describe where the consensus was among the group. I do think there were two other pieces that I think also were sort of sub-subjects underneath that where we had a lot of agreement. One was on the appropriate division of labor between the various entities that are all very active, and transparency on objectives, and making sure that those things all line up, and ultimately there's someone who has to be accountable for the objectives and for allocating the division of labor. I would make a point that I made a lot during our meetings, but wasn't necessarily reflected in this, which is I think that accountability doesn't only have to happen at the top, it can also happen from the bottom up. And this gets to the point that Bambi made earlier about we have to do less coordinating and more actually just getting it done, and not have the table of 100 people and have a few key people in country under one lead. I mean, I do remember Richard Holbrooke sort of saying, you know, his time in Washington, he saw all these people trying to coordinate things, and he got to a point where he figured, no, that was a fool's errand, that we should stop trying to coordinate anything. And sort of just do it. And I think to some extent, where I think we can create that accountability and division of labor is within the country identifying which agencies really should have the lead in each country, and then have the other agencies fall in underneath those, and have that table be a much tighter group in each country instead of a sort of a massive 100-foot-long table, so to speak. To this point about the short-term focus of the private investors versus the long-term requirements of development. That's a very nice plug for what I do today, which is impact investment. I mean, the whole rationale of impact investment is the idea to take an investment approach that has a longer-term view than a purely commercial approach. Everything we do in impact investment is focused on taking the opportunities that we're trying to bring to market to ultimately be attractive to purely commercial investors who have that type of time frame, David, that you're talking about. But we recognize that in the environments in which we work, you need to have investors who are willing to value something other than just the 6-month return. And working with those investors, you hopefully can bring a lot of capital into these environments. And that's, to a large extent, in many of these environments where purely commercial capital is not likely to come in the short term, that's where impact investors can fill the gap. The good news is our world of impact investing is growing, not quite at the rates that we hope it to, but at pretty solid regular rates. And the last point, it was
offense versus defense.
Offense versus. Oh no, it was the point, Michelle, you made about the fact that when you tried to do a private sector deal, and the folks at USAID, they didn't quite have the competence. Well, I would argue that's where my old colleagues at OPIC come in. And that is where that division of labor really needs to be identified, and where we need to say, look, these types of activities are best done here. Let's utilize the parts of our government that do that well, and let them collaborate with their colleagues at another agency. But let's not try and have 5 different agencies trying to do the same job as one. Let's try and allocate the task to the groups that have that competence. Building on what Susan said, there's investing is a competence. It's a profession. Development is a competence. It's a profession. We have agencies that have people who are very competent at both. Let's utilize those.
Okay, I think we got to end it here. Please join me in thanking the panel.